For 3 years, I was the concubine of the regent. I had seen him dressed elegantly and had scolded him as a beast during moments of passion. When I heard the news that he was about to marry, I fled overnight. Later, I was accidentally caught. He imprisoned me in bed, laughing like a madman. Ah, Yuan, when you do something wrong, you must face the consequences. 01. When I was 17, my wet nurse presented me with two paths. One was to become the main wife of the chief eunuch in the palace. The other was to be the concubine of the regent, Yan Chen. Both choices sounded rather disgraceful, but they were the best options my wet nurse could find for me. She and my mother were old acquaintances, and the past friendship led her to sincerely analyze my situation. She said that although the eunuch was old, he could give me a title. If he were to die one day, I could inherit his accumulated wealth. On the other hand, while the regent was young and handsome and hadn't married yet, I would remain a nameless concubine for life. I interrupted her, asking, "Wet nurse, who has more money?" She was taken aback. I calmly repeated, "I want to choose the one with money." So a small sedan chair swayed as I was taken to one of the regent Yan Chen's villas. The servants in the villa treated me coldly. Their eyes were filled with mockery as they looked at me. I had heard their whispered conversations countless times. They said the prince had brought back a woman of such low status. They speculated that I must have used some vulgar means to ensnare him. In short, they believed that their prince was a noble saint while I was a seductive demon. Every time I heard those words, I could only laugh. I suppose my background was a mark of shame stamped on me. Once anyone learned I came from a brothel, they deemed me lowly and automatically assigned me numerous crimes. They had no idea that I was still innocent and had never met the prince they spoke of. Yet, aside from the cold words of the servants, my days in the villa were the most peaceful I had ever experienced. I no longer had to endure endless hard labor. I didn't have to listen to other girls being abused by customers, waking up terrified to greet the dawn. And I was no longer afraid of being sold to an unknown man of any age at any moment by my wet nurse. For me, that was happiness enough. Yan Chen seemed to have many official duties. I hadn't seen him for a long time after moving into the villa. I even thought he had forgotten me and that he had a villa like this under his name. My thoughts were almost naive in their optimism. I imagined it would be nice to spend a quiet life in this spacious villa. 02. That peace was shattered one night a month later. I suddenly woke up in fright. In the dim moonlight, I saw a horrifying scene. A man was sitting by my bed. Backlit, I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could faintly sense he was quietly watching me, having sat there for who knows how long. My heart tightened in fear, and I instinctively wanted to scream. The man seemed to have anticipated this. Just as I opened my mouth, he reached out and gripped my throat tightly. A strong feeling of suffocation surged, filled with murderous intent. I even thought I could smell the blood on his sleeve, just like a cat enjoys torturing a mouse. This man wasn't in a hurry to kill me. It was as if he found it all quite amusing. His hand tightened slowly, making me feel how thin the air I could breathe had become. I dared not move, keeping my mouth open to breathe, quietly staring at his face. There were plenty of customers with special preferences in the brothel. My wet nurse had taught me that when facing an abuser, resistance only stirred their brutality more. Extreme submission could help one avoid disaster. 03. The methods women had learned through countless tears were indeed effective. After a while, a soft chuckle broke the tension. The man shifted slightly. He released his grip and leaned closer to examine me. In the moonlight, I finally saw his face clearly. It was more handsome than any figure in a painting. I calmly spoke, testing the waters. "Your Highness?" He was taken aback for a moment, then laughed softly, his demeanor flirtatious. How clever. His tone was tender, as if he were a lover wanting to spend a wonderful night with me. But I felt a chill all over. I thought he was an assassin or perhaps a foe of the regent. I never imagined it would be Yan Chen himself. As the rumors said, the regent appeared to be a transcendent figure, yet in reality, he was capricious, cruel, and demonic. At that moment, he truly seemed like he wanted to kill me. 04. It was already late autumn, but Yan Chen wore only a black nightgown. His hair hung loosely, and his face was frighteningly pale. Only the corner of his eyes glowed with an unnatural red, resembling a drop of mournful, seductive blood. He looked like a demon that had crawled out of hell. I keenly sensed the heavy annoyance and fatigue etched between his brows. He seemed to have gone several days without sleep. I was too familiar with this state. I sat up and gently gazed at him. My throat still burned painfully after the near-death experience, but I tried hard to ignore the discomfort, speaking as normally as I could. I said, "I've learned some massage techniques from the female physician. If your highness is interested, could you let me try them on you?" Yan Chen looked at me for a moment, then suddenly smiled and agreed. He lazily leaned against the side of the bed while I carefully knelt behind him. My fingers gently brushed his temples. In that moment, I could clearly feel Yan Chen's body tense up. I lowered my eyes, continuing my movements calmly. 05. The Regent wielded immense power, but had little interest in women. This had long been a mystery in the market. After I moved into this villa, I learned that he wasn't without women. He had killed them all. He suffered from a head illness. When it flared up, his eyes would turn bloodshot, and his temperament became violent. If someone displeased him, he would kill them. Upon learning this, I felt both shocked and relieved. I was shocked at my own ignorance when making my choice. If Yan Chen suddenly fell ill, my life would be in danger. But I was relieved because I was familiar with this illness. My mother had a similar condition to Yan Chen. When it hurt, she would act like a madwoman. However, she didn't kill anyone. She could only torment me. To lessen her suffering and improve my own life, I had been seeking medical treatment since I was a child. Heaven was kind to me, allowing me to find a massage technique from an old master that could significantly relieve headaches. However, after my mother died, I hadn't massaged anyone for a long time. My skills were a bit rusty, but fortunately, Yan Chen didn't mind. After half an incense stick's time, he suddenly grabbed my wrist, signaling me to stop. "I'm tired." He spoke slowly, his gaze a bit unfocused. I knew the massage was working and gently said, "Then, would your highness like to rest?" Before I could finish my sentence, Yan Chen swayed, and with a loud thud, he fell asleep on the spot. I was stunned and looked down at him. Yan Chen lay on my bed, breathing steadily, his expression peaceful. His eyes were closed, his thin lips pressed together, and his hair was casually disheveled at the side of his face. He looked frail and sickly, so different from the unpredictable and brutal man I had just seen. I suddenly felt a fleeting illusion. At that moment, he was no longer the regent. He was just a sickly young master from a wealthy family. 06. Yan Chen began visiting me more frequently. He said that when he was with me, his head didn't hurt. He would steal kisses from me. Each morning, he would tenderly remind me to wait for him to come back. This was also the best period for our relationship. I started to immerse myself in this romance. So when I heard the news that Yan Chen was to marry a princess, I felt unexpectedly desolate. That night, when Yan Chen saw me staring blankly at the table, he laughed and wrapped his arms around me, asking what was wrong. I hesitated for a long time before tentatively asking, "Are you getting married?" Yan Chen's smile faltered. Then his expression turned cold. "That's none of your concern. You just need to stay here quietly and wait for me to return." I couldn't help but ask, "Just like this, for a lifetime?" He stared at me for a long time before suddenly letting out a cold laugh. He retorted, "What else would you want? Do you want to leave?" He looked down at me. "Ah, Yuan, you need to recognize your place." My heart felt like it had been pierced. I blankly nodded, saying okay. Then I fell silent. I was merely a bit sad and forgot to show him the flattering smile. But I still angered him. The next moment, he suddenly seized my wrist and yanked me up forcefully. He trapped my neck with one hand, forcing me to look at the bronze mirror. As he admired my fear reflected in the mirror, he gently stroked my cheek with his thumb, as if playing with porcelain. The jade ring on his hand was icy cold, causing me to shiver involuntarily. Yan Chen noticed this and smirked with a hint of amusement. His thumb casually brushed against my face. The ring slipped off and silently fell into the neckline of my gauzy robe. The coldness snaked down through the opening. Finally, it stopped at my waist. My face flushed so deeply it felt like it could bleed. Yet he only laughed. Leaning closer to my ear, he spoke playfully. "Am I being too indulgent with you, making you forget your purpose?" 07. That night, Yan Chen showed no mercy. I couldn't help but cry out, but he only laughed more wickedly. I knew he wanted to torment me to make me understand my place. I also knew that besides enduring, I had no other choice. When the sky began to brighten, he finally let me go. I lay on the bed, eyes wide open. The soreness all over my body kept me unusually alert. Yan Chen hadn't slept either. After torturing me all night, his anger seemed to have subsided. He seriously told me, "You're not allowed to cause trouble anymore." Seeing my still listless expression, he asked, "Is there anything you want? I'll give it to you." I knew this was his way of compensating me. Without hesitation, I replied, "Money." Yan Chen laughed at my simplicity. I laughed too. Yes, I was indeed simple-minded and foolish. I was like a stray dog. Regardless of how many cold glances and tortures I faced, I would never fight back. If someone were willing to give me a bone, I would be immensely happy. 08. The next day, countless rare treasures and silks flowed into my courtyard like a river. I accepted them. But since that night, I had not forgotten that he was of noble blood, while I was like a blade of grass. An immense gap in status loomed between Yan Chen and me. So when the rumored princess he was betrothed to came looking for me, I wasn't too surprised. That day, I was in the jewelry shop selecting accessories with my maidservants when a well-dressed old woman suddenly walked in, saying her young lady wanted to meet me at the tea house across the street. I didn't take it seriously, turning to call my maid as I prepared to leave. The old woman wore a faintly mocking smile and glanced toward the door. Only then did I see two strong-looking young men standing at the entrance. Today, even if I didn't want to go, they could probably drag me to the tea house. It was clearly a trap, but I had no choice but to attend. Once upstairs and inside the room, I found 6 or 7 young girls sitting in a spacious private chamber. As I walked in, they all set down their teacups and stared at me in silence, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain, filled with scrutiny. They were all dressed elegantly, like snow. In the center sat a girl in luxurious clothing. The moment I glanced at her, her maidservant shouted imperiously, boldly, "How dare you, a lowly commoner, not kneel before the princess?" In an instant, I understood the intention behind this gathering. This proud young princess had learned of my existence and summoned me to humiliate me, trying to assert her future role as a wife. I obediently bowed and knelt, performing the required rites. The princess smiled and said, "Rise." But she did not offer me a seat. I got up and continued to stand in place, listening to their sneers, each taking a turn to mock me without any vulgarity. I maintained my calm demeanor. What a joke. I had heard far worse and filthier insults in the brothel. Not seeing me angered, their faces darkened. Yet the princess laughed, her gaze surveying me with curiosity. She waved her hand, sending the others out, leaving just the 2 of us in the room. She asked, "Do you know why I called you here?" I replied, "Because the prince only has me as his concubine now, and he cares about me." "You're quite honest." The princess smiled and straightforwardly said, "My wedding with the prince is approaching, but I don't like sharing my husband with others." She glanced at me with undisguised disdain. "Especially not with a lowly commoner like you." "So," she arrogantly lifted her chin, "I'm offering you 1,000 taels of silver, hoping you'll be wise enough to leave on your own." 1,000 taels? So stingy. The gold and jewels Yan Chen gave me were worth far more than that. I couldn't help but laugh. I shook my head and said, "Princess, you don't understand. The prince is my first man. He treats me well, and I've enjoyed a taste of wealth by his side. So, Seeing the princess's brows furrow in anger, I stared into her eyes and spoke deliberately. "You'll need to offer more." 09. I successfully raised the price from 1,000 taels to 5,000 taels of gold. I was quite satisfied with this outcome, and so was the princess. She received my promise to leave and the secret for relieving headaches through massage. I readily declared that the moment she commanded, I would pack my things and leave immediately. The princess looked at my beaming face, somewhat stunned. She suddenly spoke with a sigh. "People like you are truly heartless. The prince cares for you, yet you choose to leave him without hesitation for money." Her gaze toward me was filled with disdain from her lofty position. I couldn't help but laugh. Yan Chen didn't understand why I loved money so much. The servants mocked me as lowly and licentious. Even the princess wanted to ridicule me for my pursuit of wealth. They didn't know I was terrified of poverty, terrified of suffering. My mother was once a renowned courtesan. She was beautiful and a master at the guillotine. Countless officials and nobles scrambled to pay her ransom. But she only had eyes for my father, who was then just a poor scholar. She used all her savings to provide him with travel expenses to take the imperial exam, helping him achieve his ambitions. Yet after my father attained his degree, he turned around and became the wealthy son-in-law of the Grand Tutor. Seizing that opportunity, he quickly rose to become an inspector. At that time, my mother took me, just 5 years old, to find my father, stubbornly wanting to ask why his promises from back then didn't count. But we were driven away with sticks. The steward even released dogs to bite us. He laughed and clapped as he watched us flee in disarray. He even said my mother had lost her mind, daring to bring a bastard from a brothel to make a scene. Passers-by pointed at us with disdainful eyes. That winter was incredibly cold. I held my mother, bruised and battered, in the snow, crying out loud. Far away, I could hear my father laughing with his wife and children. Snow kept falling, covering all the filth and burying my mother's life. Now, many years later, I still dream about that endless snow and the bone-chilling cold. Each time I dream, my resolve strengthens even more. I don't want sincerity. I just want a lot of money. So much that I can always have enough to eat. So much that I never have to endure humiliation again. Besides, I am just a concubine kept in another courtyard. Even if I have the fortune to enter the royal palace in the future, what then? If I were to quarrel with a noble princess, would Yan Chen favor me? I know my place well. 10. Most importantly, I have no certainty in my love for Yan Chen. The most memorable time was on my first birthday spent in the other courtyard. Yan Chen sent me many gifts and personally wished me a happy birthday. This was the first time anyone was willing to celebrate my birthday since my mother's passing. I was so happy. I thought for a long time and finally decided to ask the kitchen lady to teach me how to make longevity noodles. I wanted to eat with Yan Chen, but when I held the steaming bowl of noodles and went to find him in the study, I happened to see him laughing and chatting with several noblemen. One of the men, upon seeing me, brightened up and hurriedly asked Yan Chen who I was. Just a concubine. Yan Chen casually glanced at me. If you like her, I'll give her to you. Although that man laughed and declined. At that moment, I felt as if I had fallen into an abyss. Clearly, when Yan Chen had tenderly kissed me that morning and wished me a happy birthday, he had spoken in the same gentle tone. Yet he turned around and casually offered me away in such a gentle tone. I had once thought he felt differently toward me, but in reality, he merely saw me as a plaything. 11. Recently, Yan Chen has become increasingly busy. One morning, he kissed my forehead and said, "I'm going to the border to inspect the troops. I might be gone for 2 or 3 months." I obediently nodded and replied, "I wish the prince a safe journey. I'll wait for your return." Yan Chen was pleased with my compliance and spent a while longer with me before finally leaving. As I watched his robes disappear at the end of the corridor, my smile slowly faded. I adjusted my cloak and turned back to the room, expressionless as I instructed the maid, "Go help me deliver a letter to the princess. Quickly." 12. Half a month later, on a night, the princess waited for me by the bridge, with a carriage parked nearby. She glanced at the large wooden box beside me, large enough to hold a whole person, and her brows twitched in disbelief. "Are you moving the entire royal residence?" She couldn't help but ask me. I looked at her with a justified expression and replied, "These are all things the prince gave me. If I don't take them, it would be a waste." The princess was speechless. "All right, let's go." The driver cracked his whip and set off. Maybe it was because my jewelry and gold were too heavy, but the horse stumbled a bit, backing up a few steps before finally regaining its balance and continuing on the road. I had been confined in the back courtyard for 20 years. From the brothel to the other courtyard, I felt like a bird kept in captivity. I had merely traded a small cage for a larger one. The night was dark, and the road was devoid of passers-by. I leaned my head out the window, greedily breathing in the fresh air of the mountains. This was the first time I was free from anyone's constraints, truly free. 13. I settled down in a small town in Jiangnan after leaving the royal residence. The environment here was tranquil, and there were few travelers, a stark contrast to the bustling scene of the imperial city. Sometimes, I would sit by the window, peeling water chestnuts, reminiscing about the time spent with Yan Chen in the courtyard, and I would feel a disorienting sense of detachment. It was as if those were ethereal memories from a past life. Occasionally, I would go to the tea house to buy snacks, and I could still hear the storyteller recounting recent news from the imperial city. The storyteller mentioned that the young emperor was gravely ill, and the regent's power was growing stronger. The waiter brought over warm pastries. "Thank you." I took them and turned away without a trace of reluctance. Thus, I didn't hear the storyteller's next words. I had no idea he would say that. Recently, the regent's headaches had worsened, and his temperament had become increasingly strange. The princess engaged to him had also been thrown into prison, her fate unknown. 14. In the third month after I settled down, a notice was posted in the town. It announced a reward of 1,000 taels of gold for the search of a woman. Such a large sum? I was curious. The town was half a day's journey from the village I lived in, so I only went there when I needed to buy something. Just yesterday, I had been in town when old Wang nodded and said, "I heard that it's someone's beloved concubine who has run away." I froze for a moment, continuing to sweep the floor without responding. Old Wang didn't notice my unease and spitted out sunflower seeds, excitedly saying, "By the way, Yuan, you should get married at your age. Find a husband to take care of you. How about I introduce you to a scholar? His family is well off, and he's currently taking the imperial examination. You'd definitely not suffer if you marry him." Old Wang was overly enthusiastic. I tried to refuse several times, but she always found a way to counter my words. Finally, I was left with no choice but to agree to meet him. I wanted to clarify things in front of the scholar. So, 3 days later, I sat in a corner of the tea house, waiting for him to arrive. Strangely, the scholar that old Wang had described as extremely polite was late. I could only wait patiently. After drinking 2 pots of tea, I leaned my chin on my hand, drowsy. 2 hours passed, and just as the sun was about to set, a shadow finally loomed over me, blocking the sunlight. Someone had arrived. I quickly masked my fatigue and put on a gentle smile. I slowly raised my head to greet the scholar politely. "You finally." The next second, seeing the person's face, my expression went pale. The visitor was not the scholar. It was the regent, whom I hadn't seen for months. I trembled in fear, frozen in place, unable to move. Yan Chen leaned down and stared at me. His expression was dark, and his pitch-black eyes were bloodshot. The entire aura was terrifyingly gloomy. An overwhelmingly dangerous air surged toward me. He grasped my chin, gritting his teeth and smiling. Yuan, have you been living happily since leaving me?" 15. Yan Chen carried me into a room. My hands were bound, tied to the headboard. My eyes were covered with black silk, rendering me unable to move or see anything. The loss of sight heightened my other senses. I could feel Yan Chen's fingers, rough with calluses, tracing my body inch by inch. His low, hoarse voice echoed in my ears. "Yuan, if you do something wrong, You must accept the punishment. I tried my best to keep my tone steady and asked, Prince, you are about to get married. Can't you just let me go? Yan Chen continued to smile, but his tone turned increasingly cold. Are you talking about that woman who encouraged your escape? She's gone mad in prison. Thinking of the proud princess becoming a madwoman now sent chills down my spine. We spent the night awake. In the morning, Yan Chen wiped the tears off my face and spoke in my ear, his voice laced with an almost insane obsession. He said, It was you who enticed me first. How can you think of leaving? You will always stay by my side obediently. 15. I could not escape from Yan Chen, so I began to coldly war with him, silently resisting in this way. Yan Chen forcibly brought me back to the capital. Seemingly afraid I would run away again, he took me into the palace and locked me in his main chamber. Looking at the closed door, I couldn't help but smile. I never expected to enter the palace in this way. One night, Yan Chen suddenly woke from a nightmare. He instinctively reached out to touch the space beside him. When he found my hand, I heard him let out a sigh of relief. I thought you left me again, he said, hooking my pinky finger, his voice very low. I said nothing, but Yan Chen seemed to know I was still awake. He began to talk to me, sharing how he was not favored by the emperor as a child and how he felt lost without me. At last, he suddenly sat up and looked at me. His eyes appeared strange in the moonlight but shone brightly. Yuan, have a child for me. I looked up at him, my tone very flat. I don't want to. Yan Chen ignored my response. He shamelessly leaned closer and held me tightly. His tall figure pressed closely against my back, like a poisonous vine, tightly wrapping around me. I heard his murmurs in my ear. He said, This way, you won't be able to leave me again. 16. I thought Yan Chen was just being impulsive. But unexpectedly, he began to seriously implement his plan from the next day. He even found a famous doctor to prescribe fertility medicine for me, forcing me to drink it. The medicine was truly bitter. I frowned and gulped it down. The butler had an expressionless face, just cupping his hands toward me. Please forgive me. This is the prince's order, and I am just following orders. The butler's words were polite, but he didn't treat me with any respect. Perhaps he thought that I, still nameless and unacknowledged, was just a plaything for Yan Chen and that I could be discarded at any moment. I let out a cold smile and said nothing. 17. It wasn't that I was too good-natured to let a shrewd servant bully me. I had something more important to do. That was to induce vomiting. Seeing the butler walk away, I immediately bent down, pressed my throat, and expelled all the medicine. This process was painful. After throwing up the medicine, my face often turned pale and haggard. But I still persisted in doing this. I didn't want to bear Yan Chen's child. I didn't want my child to go through the same fate I had experienced. I thought my methods were discreet enough that no one would discover them. But I didn't anticipate that one day Yan Chen would return early from court to see me. The spittoon was filled with dark herbal medicine. The evidence was undeniable. My face was pale as I met his gaze in silence, stubbornly refusing to speak. Yan Chen's eyes slowly turned red as he gritted his teeth. Do you really not want to bear my child? Accustomed to seeing his gloomy and cold demeanor, I was surprised to find rare panic and hurt in his eyes at this moment. I unexpectedly smiled. Looking into his eyes, I spoke slowly. That's right. I am your concubine. What will the child I give birth to be? A servant? Or a forever unacknowledged illegitimate child? I looked at him with a mocking gaze. Even if this child is born, they will inevitably suffer a miserable fate like mine, subjected to cold stares. So, I would rather they not be born, to avoid this suffering. After saying this, I closed my eyes, not wanting to look at him anymore. I thought he would be furious, that I would anger him into leaving, or he would inflict another round of endless punishment on me. Whatever. I thought tiredly. However, the next second, I heard his low voice. I'm sorry. I instinctively opened my eyes to look at him, somewhat in disbelief. How could the proud regent, Yan Chen, actually apologize? Yan Chen's gaze flickered. not daring to look at me. His voice was low. No one has ever taught me how to love someone. I just wanted you to stay by my side. But it seems I've used the wrong method. I will change. Can you not be angry? I fell silent for a moment, yet hope ignited within me. I knew that fate had never been kind to me, but this time, I wanted to give it another try. So I looked seriously into his eyes, speaking word by word. I want you to respect me and love me wholeheartedly. I wanted a normal love, not one where I was the only one humbling myself in desperation. Yan Chen's lips moved. After a moment, he said, "All right, I promise you." 18. Yan Chen may really be trying to learn how to love someone. Although his methods were clumsy, he chose to follow me everywhere at all times. I leaned against the pavilion railing to feed fish while he sat in the pavilion reading. I lowered my head to embroider a purse while he sat at the table reviewing documents. If he had some free time, he would accompany me to the hunting grounds to ride horses, patiently teaching me how to tame a horse. We did not engage in any intimate actions again, but I felt a fluttering sensation in my heart from time to time. 19. That day, Yan Chen went out to work, telling me before he left that he would return later and that I didn't need to wait for him to have dinner. I said all right, and, with nothing to do during the day, I was in the courtyard with the maidservants, painting flower patterns. Suddenly, a small guard stumbled in, saying it was bad. The prince's head ailment had acted up again. I frowned and asked what happened. It turned out that an assassin had attempted to kill him. Although it failed, Yan Chen was still injured. The blood and murderous intent stimulated him, causing the head ailment to flare up, and he began to kill again. He first skinned the assassins alive and was about to kill the guards and eunuchs present today. The little guard pleaded with me to intercede for them. After hearing this, I picked up an almond and put it in my mouth, maintaining a calm expression. I shook my head. I don't have the ability to help you. The little guard panicked at once. His eyes turned red with despair. I glanced at him without speaking. I thought he had come to me, probably holding on to the hope of risking everything. But I truly couldn't save him, because the head ailment was closely related to his emotions. When the patient was injured and uncomfortable, the head ailment would worsen, becoming uncontrollable, almost like a demon. In my childhood, if my mother was beaten and bruised after entertaining clients, I would inevitably be beaten by her in return. I would cry and try to persuade her, or I would massage her like I usually did. All of it was in vain. In the past, I couldn't escape from my mother's bamboo stick. Today, I certainly couldn't soothe Yan Chen as usual. I could only maintain peace with Yan Chen now, so why take the risk? So I spoke lightly. "You can leave." 20. The young guard didn't leave. Instead, he knelt down with a thud. He prostrated on the ground, tears streaming down his face, repeatedly knocking his head. His forehead quickly swelled with horrifying bruises, but he seemed to feel no pain, mechanically repeating the motions. A sudden tremor ran through my heart. I remembered my younger self. I had once felt this same desperation. "Fine." I let out a barely audible sigh. I felt pity. I said, "I'll go with you." The young guard cautiously led the way, his back hunched. As I stepped over the threshold of the palace, I looked up to see dark clouds gathering. A storm was coming. Expressionless, I draped a cloak over my shoulders, thinking, "I'll go just this once. If I die by Yan Chen's sword, I can at least hold my head high." 21. I got off the carriage and saw the ground covered with dark red blood that had long dried. A group of guards knelt on the blood-soaked ground. In the distance, officials trembled as they stuttered their pleas. Yan Chen lowered his head, his expression emotionless, a glinting sword resting casually against a guard's neck. I gently furrowed my brows and tried to call out to him, "Yan Chen?" He looked up at my voice. The moment I saw his face, I instinctively held my breath. His handsome face appeared as if half-painted. One side looked normal, while the other was splattered with blood. It exuded a forbidden and dangerous aura, his dark pupils fixed on me unblinking. After a moment, he suddenly smiled at me, revealing his sharp, white teeth. He approached me, sword in hand. The tip of the sword scraped the ground, producing a chilling sound. My heart raced with panic. Yet my expression remained calm. I tried to invoke Yan Chen's reason with past memories. I smiled and said, "If your head hurts, let's go home. I've made you some medicine. Drink it and it won't hurt anymore." I added, "I'm cold. Come and hold me." People looked at me with pitying expressions as if they were thinking, "Goodness, what is this fool saying? Can a few words really make a difference?" They probably believed I was about to be torn apart by the Regent. The next second, to everyone's astonishment, Yan Chen's right hand trembled spasmodically, and with a clang, he finally dropped the sword. It fell to the ground, splattering blood. Everyone stared in disbelief at the scene. They widened their eyes, examining me from head to toe, then furtively glancing at Yan Chen's expression. I knew they found it hard to believe. They didn't believe that the cold, terrifying Regent, with immense power, would actually listen to me, that he would genuinely bow his head to a lowly woman. 22. Yan Chen staggered over to me and hugged me. His tall and broad shoulders slumped pitifully as he buried his head in my neck. He rubbed his face against mine and murmured, "It hurts." The blood on his face smeared all over mine, sticky and warm. I didn't wipe it off. I just calmly stroked his hair. I said, "It's okay, let's go home." I increasingly felt like I was training a dog. There seemed to be an invisible chain firmly held in my hands. The other end was clamped around Yan Chen's neck. This chain was soft and even fragile. If Yan Chen wanted to break free, he could at any time. But the strange thing was, he seemed never to have thought of resisting my commands. I told him not to kill indiscriminately anymore. I told him not to be angry all the time and to smile more. I even told him I wanted to sleep peacefully at night. Though in this regard, he never listened. 23. When the snow stopped at the end of the year, I went alone to the government office with a complaint, knocking on the drum for petitions outside. I was suing the current censors for breaking their vows, cheating for money, and killing my mother to silence her. The officials didn't recognize me at first. Seeing my decent attire, they treated me with great respect. But after reading my complaint, their faces turned to mockery. "You, a woman from a brothel, dare to sue the current censors? He's the son-in-law of the Grand Tutor." He tossed my complaint to the ground dismissively. Another official sneered, "Do you really think of yourself as a good citizen? Is this court the place for you? Get lost." I had heard similar words years ago at the gate of the censor's office. Back then, I hung my head in shame. But now I understood that being born lowly was not my fault. I had no reason to feel ashamed of it. The ones who should feel ashamed were the shallow-eyed people who divided others into ranks based solely on status. I knelt under the plaque that read, "Justice is bright," unmoved. I just repeated coldly, "I want justice." "Hey!" An official glared at me, raising his hand as if to strike. Just as his hand was about to come down, it was seized forcefully by someone rushing in. It was Yan Chen. "Did you learn the law from a dog's belly? Who taught you to attack those seeking justice?" "Besides," he said with a stern expression, word for word, "this is my princess." I was taken aback, looking up at Yan Chen in surprise. I didn't expect him to show up here to support me. I didn't expect him to genuinely give me a rightful and honorable identity alongside him. When the officials saw Yan Chen, they trembled and knelt, begging for mercy. The others turned pale, scrambling to fetch the magistrate. Seeing this, Yan Chen bent down and helped me up. He didn't ask me about my childhood traumas or why I stubbornly sought justice against the odds. He simply hugged me and softly said, "You don't have to be afraid. I'm here." Tears suddenly streamed down my face. I thought I was luckier than my mother. I had a beloved person willing to stand by my side in times of crisis and protect me. 24. Yan Chen's arrival made the magistrate unable to withstand the pressure and forced him to seriously investigate the case, seeking witnesses and recording testimonies. Countless commoners gathered to watch, and after hearing my story, they became enraged. Once the magistrate confirmed my claims, My censor father was forced to bow his head and express late regret to my mother. He was ultimately sentenced to a 3-year salary reduction. To be honest, this punishment was insignificant compared to my mother's life. However, civil officials value their reputations above all else. Today's case had spread throughout the capital, ruining his name. Moreover, his father-in-law, the Grand Tutor, left in a huff from the courtroom. I thought that in the days to come, he wouldn't have it easy. He would feel the world's scorn and cold eyes. That might be even harder for him than dying. As I walked out of the courtroom, I exhaled the stagnant breath that had built up over the years. At this moment, Yan Chen took my hand and called me princess. He said, "Let's go home." I smiled back, unable to resist looking up at the sky. The leaves were new and green. The ice and snow had melted. The long winter had finally passed. I thought from now on it would be good times ahead.